What if someone destroyed 2 Russian nuclear reactors and no one noticed? Well, that may be the situation that we are currently looking at, leading to a whodunit best suited for Benoit Blanc. The country with the most motive seemingly lacked the ability to conduct the attack. The country with the greatest ability to conduct the attack was the victim of the attack, and we do not know for sure that anyone else had the ability to conduct the attack, and none of them had the disposition to strike the victim anyway. Well, time to get our knives out and get to the bottom of this. Let me walk you through all of the details, because the case is indeed as crazy as it sounds. Flashback to August 2024. Ukraine played the good old-fashioned Uno reverse card and invaded Kursk. Kursk being a part of internationally recognized Russia, you would think that Russian regulars would be activated to defend the region. But no. Those would-be defenders were conscripts, meaning that they did not volunteer to give their lives for the broader Ukraine war effort. And although this was now a battle for proper Russian soil, your average Alexander saw right through what was happening and wanted no part of the Kursk defense. The Kremlin, not wanting to see protests on the streets, obliged. But that came with its own dilemma. Putin did not want to slow the progress that Russian troops were seeing in eastern Ukraine, and rerouting all of those soldiers up north would almost certainly lead to that result. Consequently, Putin did what anyone else would do in this situation. He called North Korea for help. Perhaps 12,000 North Korean troops traveled to Kursk to take part in its defense. Meanwhile, in a seemingly completely unrelated situation, the Russian heavy lift ship MV Ursa Major departed St. Petersburg on December 11th. Trust me for a minute, because this story will eventually loop back to North Korea. On board were 2 massive hatches intended for a Project 10510 icebreaker, paired with a couple of cranes to remove them. The Ursa Major planned to drop them all off in Vladivostok, using the Suez Canal as a shortcut. However, on December 22nd, while the Ursa Major was in the international waters of the Mediterranean Sea, just between Spain and Algeria, it suddenly stopped moving. The next day, it sank. 2 crew members died. At the time, reports indicated that an explosion in the Ursa Major's engine room doomed the ship. Now, the Ursa Major was under sanction at the time, as a part of Russia's broader shadow fleet, and Ukraine certainly enjoyed taking potshots at Russia. But it was a little much to think that Kyiv had gotten access to the engine room of a Russian ship, seemingly disconnected from the rest of the war effort. And so the story faded into relative obscurity. The Kremlin complained to anyone who would listen, but no one really cared, at least not publicly. However, for the past year, Spain's government has been investigating the nature of the incident. And what has the Spanish Inquisition discovered? Nope, not heretics this time. Rather, a salacious allegation involving nuclear reactors. Here are the details, as originally reported in the Spanish outlet La Verdad. The Russian icebreaker story was a ruse. The Ursa Major was actually carrying 2 nuclear reactors designed to power submarines, or at least many of the component parts that would eventually be reassembled into nuclear reactors. There are no indications that any nuclear fuel was involved, though, so no one needs to worry about another environmental catastrophe on the continental shelf. Anyway, the intrigue goes beyond just the cargo. Instead of heading to Vladivostok, Russia intended to take the reactors to North Korea. I told you that this was all connected. The cranes on board were necessary because North Korean ports lacked a way to offload the cargo. To be clear, the reactors in this context are engines. They convert uranium into power by turning turbines. There is no allegation that Russia was attempting to give North Korea a nuclear weapon, though North Korea already has plenty of bombs at this point. Actually, the type of smaller reactor that you would find on a nuclear-powered submarine is harder to build than a nuclear weapon, which is why North Korea was potentially interested in them in the first place. It seems that this was part of a secret annex to North Korea's compensation for assisting Russia in Kursk. Now, we already knew that Kim Jong-un had extracted quite the price from the Kremlin. Putin has traveled to North Korea to celebrate their friendship, and we know that Russia has assisted its junior partner with missile technology. Well, that friendship apparently extends to Russia helping North Korea build nuclear submarines, which, with an astonishingly good sense of timing, Pyongyang released the first images of, right as Spain's investigation came to light. And it is not just the North Korean sub-program that fits with Spain's interpretation of the facts. Other facets of the Russian story are hard to make sense of. The equipment for icebreakers could have instead traveled by rail. The reactor components were too heavy to do so, necessitating the naval route. The damage to the hull had the edges bent inward, meaning that the blast came from the outside. This was not a simple case of engine room troubles. The Ivan Gren, a Russian naval ship, commandeered control over the search and rescue site. Odd if the Ursa Major was only transporting civilian goods. It also fired multiple flares around the sinking ship, as if to obscure Spanish intelligence collection efforts. At the time of the sinking, seismographs collected data consistent with large explosions around the site, as if Russia wanted to blast away any lingering evidence. The Yantar, a Russian intelligence ship, arrived in early January. It is capable of deploying deep-diving submarines, as if Russia wanted to verify that no evidence remained on the seabed. And that raises the billion-dollar question. If Spain's interpretation of the facts is correct, who did it? Well, the obvious starting point would be Ukraine. It was a Russian vessel after all, and Ukraine is at war with, checks notes, Russia. Moreover, Ukraine had previously shown an interest in these types of attacks, with the Nord Stream sabotage now widely being believed to have Ukraine's fingerprints. Now, Ukraine may have evaded scrutiny at the time of the Ursa Major sinking, because it might not have seemed plausible in that moment, despite the difficulty of the Nord Stream sabotage, and despite Ukraine having plenty of motive. However, Ukraine has recently shown quite the capacity to strike naval vessels at long distances. There was the attack on a Russian submarine on December 15th at a Black Sea port. Plus, Ukraine has struck a bunch of tankers sailing in the Black Sea, some other vessels and an oil rig on the Caspian Sea, as well as a random tanker off the coast of Senegal. Oh, and I forgot about this one. They actually struck another ship on the Mediterranean. Still, it would be weird if Ukraine had developed the technology and global network to commit these attacks back at the end of 2024, and yet went almost a year before actually taking action again. Moreover, the La Verdad article contains this spicy nugget. The Ursa Major's captain testified about the damage, and his description is inconsistent with a conventional torpedo. But it is consistent with a super captivating torpedo. Y además si hablo español muy bien. My Spanish language skills aside, this does raise the question of what the heck is a super captivating torpedo anyway? Well, join me in learning a cool science lesson for the day. Conventional torpedoes normally swim through the water like anything else. Water, as a liquid, adds drag to the equation, thus limiting the speed of a torpedo. A super captivating torpedo, by contrast, uses a pointed tip to create a low-pressure area around the torpedo. Thanks to the magic of thermodynamics, that vaporizes the water into a gas. Sometimes the torpedo itself may inject further gas around it. Either way, this creates a bubble that the torpedo effectively flies through. The air bubble creates less drag, which means that the torpedo can move much, much faster. In fact, they can move so fast that they can destroy ships with pure ramming speed, rather than needing to have an explosive attached to them. The thing about super captivating torpedoes, though, is that not many countries have them. Russia certainly does. Iran probably does, having reversed engineered them from the Soviet design. Germany, the United States, China, and South Korea have also been fiddling around with them. Note that Ukraine is not one of the countries that I just mentioned. Of course, Ukraine has sophisticated weapons designers, so we cannot rule out Kyiv offhand. But it would be strange that in the middle of a land-based war, Ukraine suddenly decided to invest untold bundles of cash into the fanciest of torpedo systems. That still does not preclude Ukraine in the operation overall. Even if Ukraine did not conduct this strike, Ukraine is trying the best it can to have its intelligence organizations penetrate inside of Russia. Perhaps Ukraine learned of what was happening and informed someone else, and then that someone else took action. South Korea is an interesting option, because Seoul has a vested interest in stopping North Korea from developing nuclear submarines. Perhaps Ukraine fed South Korea the information, or South Korean intelligence learned of the plot on its own, and then took countermeasures. But then you would wonder why South Korea did it here, and not here, or anywhere else closer to the Korean peninsula. South Korea operates submarines, of course, but they are not intended to travel that far out. Seoul has enough security problems at home that it tailors its navy exclusively for those threats. It is not like the United States Navy, which is seemingly everywhere at all times. Speaking of the United States, it as a possible suspect also adds intrigue. Remember that this was December of 2024, meaning that Joe Biden was still president. However, Biden took great pains to reduce escalation dynamics seemingly every place that he could find. It was not until after he lost the election that he gave Ukraine the green light to conduct some longer-range strikes. The Ursa Major sinking was during that same time period, but it is a whole different beast to greenlight a US kinetic strike on a Russian vessel. Germany was in a similar boat, if you will pardon my figure of speech. The chancellor at the time was Olaf Scholz, who shared Biden's conservative approach to escalation dynamics. Iran has no motive here, so goodness it would be bizarre to find out that it was the Ayatollah all along. And I should at least mention the conspiracy theory that it was an inside job. Perhaps Russia did not want to actually give North Korea the reactors, and so it had to find a creative solution to the problem. The idea is not entirely far-fetched. Patron states do not always want their protege states to have free reign, as the protege may then start taking actions that the patron does not support. That fact also opens up the possibility that China may have played a role here, wanting to keep North Korea under its thumb. It would also play on intra-coalition politics by ensuring that Pyongyang remains dependent on Beijing, not Moscow. But again, we are branching off into the realm of conspiracy theories. The only reason to continue walking down the Russian conspiracy path is that there are no reports that Russia tried supplying the nuclear reactors again. But that would also happen if the Kremlin is not sitting on a large stock of them. Or, alternatively, Putin just had a tough conversation with Kim that Russia already incurred the cost of those reactors, and then some, and so it had completed its half of the deal. Sorry, but Pyongyang bears the risk of shipment, not Moscow. One thing worth noting is that the La Verdad report only cites the captain's testimony as the basis for the super captivating speculation. I have seen many English-language news sources state that it was a super captivating torpedo. That is despite sourcing all of their information from La Verdad and not doing any independent reporting. Put bluntly, we do not know for certain what sunk the Ursa Major. That reopens the possibility that Ukraine was wholly responsible, but only using technology that we know that Ukraine has. Or maybe it was some other country that used something basic. Anyway, we are left where we started. The most likely candidate did not have the ability to conduct the attack as best understood. The country that definitely had the ability to conduct the attack as best understood was the victim of the attack, and everyone else that may possibly have had the ability to conduct the attack was not the type of actor to engage in such a bold operation. So we just do not know. One thing that we all know, however, is how this video is going to end, with these two fantastic books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.